The morning Agnes Rutherford arrived at Piercewood House, it was raining, not the gentle kind of rain that softens the world at its edges, the kind that soaks through wool and makes the cobblestones treacherous underfoot, the kind that reminds you, without ceremony, that the weather does not know your name and does not care what you are about to lose. She stepped down from the carriage with her left hand gripping the door frame and her right hand holding a small leather case. Inside it, a hairbrush, 2 letters, a photograph of her mother, and a copy of a contract folded 4 times and tucked inside a book of poetry she had not opened since her father fell ill. The footman offered his hand. She did not take it. She looked up at the house instead. Northgate, the name the newspapers had given to the Piercewood estate, so called because the iron gates at its entrance faced north toward the river, was not beautiful in the way Agnes had imagined beauty as a child. It was large in the way that power is large, not meant to inspire wonder, but to produce the quiet understanding that you are standing in front of something that will outlast you. 4 stories of dark stone, 12 windows on the eastern face, each one catching the grey morning light and holding it coldly. A front door of black walnut, wide enough for 2 people to enter side by side without touching, which, Agnes would come to understand, was the entire architectural point. She had 24 hours left to change her mind. She already knew she would not use them. Her father, Charles Rutherford, had been one of the finest structural engineers in the state of New York. He had spent 30 years in honest, careful work, and then spent the last 2 years of his life making a single catastrophic mistake that he had not lived long enough to correct. The mistake had a number attached to it, $41,000. That was the precise sum the Rutherford estate owed to Piercewood Rail and Development, secured against the family's remaining property in Connecticut, and a small office building on Cartwright Street that her father had purchased as an investment for Agnes's future. Her father had died in March. The debt had been called in April. The letter from Piercewood's legal office arrived on the 1st of May. It was 4 paragraphs long, written in the toneless, immaculate English of men, paid to transform destruction into procedure. The terms were clear. The deadline was the 15th of June. The signature at the bottom did not belong to Jonathan Piercewood. It belonged to his attorney, Gerald Holt, but there was a handwritten note added in a different ink, in a different hand, at the very bottom of the page. Miss Rutherford, if you wish to discuss an alternative arrangement before the deadline, I am available on Thursday mornings. J.P. She had stared at those 2 words. Alternative arrangement, longer than she would ever admit to anyone. Then she had written back. The meeting had taken place on the 14th floor of the Piercewood building on 5th Avenue. The elevator smelled of cedar and machine oil. The secretary offered her tea in a cup so thin she was afraid to grip it. Jonathan Piercewood had kept her waiting for 11 minutes. She counted them, not out of impatience, out of instinct. She already understood, walking through that door, that everything in this man's world was a form of measurement. When he finally came through the inner office door, she had expected someone older, harder perhaps in the visible way, the kind of hardness that shows itself in a jaw or in the way a man occupies a room, as if the room has been waiting for him. He was not quite what she expected. He was tall and his suit was dark and precisely cut, and he moved with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that urgency is a display of weakness. His hair was dark and slightly longer than fashion strictly required. His eyes, when they finally settled on her, were the pale grey of a winter river. Not cold exactly, but clear in a way that made her feel briefly and uncomfortably transparent. He sat down across from her without offering his hand and without preamble. "Miss Rutherford," he said, "thank you for coming." "You gave me limited alternatives," she replied. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. A minor recalibration, as if he had expected a different opening line and was quietly adjusting. "That is honest," he said. "I assumed you'd prefer it." He looked at her for a moment in silence. Then he opened the folder on the desk between them. The arrangement he proposed was, in the language of the law, entirely straightforward. The Rutherford debt would be absorbed, not forgiven, absorbed, into the estate of Jonathan Piercewood upon the legal formalization of a marriage contract. Agnes would retain the Cartwright Street building and the Connecticut property as her own. In exchange, she would serve as the mistress of Piercewood House for a period of no less than 2 years, managing the household, attending the social functions required of a woman in her position, and maintaining in all public settings the appearance of a conventional union. There was no clause about affection. There was no language about companionship. There was, however, a single additional provision, Clause 14, buried at the back of the document, written in a smaller typeface than the rest. It stated that should Agnes Rutherford be found, at any point during the contractual period, to have concealed any financial interest, prior obligation or legal arrangement that materially affected the Piercewood estate, the entire agreement would be rendered void and the original debt reinstated in full, with interest, effective immediately. She had read Clause 14 3 times in the carriage on the way to the meeting. She had signed the document anyway, and Jonathan Piercewood, watching her sign it with a steady hand, had said nothing. He had simply taken the document back, placed it in the folder and stood. "The wedding will be private," he said. 2 weeks from Saturday. My secretary will arrange the details." He paused at the door of the inner office and looked back at her once. "I trust you understand what this is, Miss Rutherford." It was not a question, but she answered it as if it were. "Yes," she said. "I understand exactly what this is." Now she stood in front of Northgate in the rain and understood that understanding something and living inside it were two entirely different things. The housekeeper met her at the door. Mrs. Calloway, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that her professional life would never be simple, led her through the entrance hall without ceremony and without warmth, but also without cruelty. Agnes appreciated the neutrality. It was the most honest thing she had encountered all morning. The house was immaculate. That was the first thing she registered. Not its size, not its furnishings, but the absolute control of it. Every surface was ordered. Every curtain fell at exactly the right angle. Flowers had been placed in 2 vases in the main corridor. White flowers, Agnes noted, not as a gesture of celebration, but because white photographed well and required no interpretation. "Mr. Piercewood will be in the city until Thursday," Mrs. Calloway said, leading her up the main staircase. "He asked that you be made comfortable and that you be given a full tour of the house at your convenience." "He is not here," Agnes said. "No, miss." Agnes looked at the top of the staircase. A long corridor stretched in both directions, lined with dark wood paneling and paintings of landscapes. No portraits, she noted. No family. Just land, rendered in oil, framed and hung at precise intervals. "Which room is mine?" she asked. Mrs. Calloway stopped before a door at the end of the east corridor and opened it without knocking, as though knocking would have implied the room might refuse her. It was large and quiet and faced the garden. A writing desk stood near the window. The bed was made with the kind of precision that suggested it had never been slept in, or at least had not been allowed to remember that it had. "Mr. Piercewood's room is at the opposite end of the corridor," Mrs. Calloway said with neither judgment nor apology, simply information cleanly delivered. "Thank you," Agnes said. The housekeeper left. Agnes stood alone in the center of the room and did not move for a long moment. Outside, the rain continued. The garden below her window was formal and bare. It was only May and the beds had been cleared and turned, but not yet planted. Dark soil in neat rectangular shapes. The iron fence at the far edge of the garden was the same black as the front gate, and beyond it, the river was flat and grey and indifferent. Agnes set her leather case on the writing desk. She did not unpack it. She sat down in the chair beside the window and looked out at the empty garden beds and thought about the contract in her book of poetry, and about Clause 14, and about the thing she had not told Jonathan Piercewood in that office on the 14th floor of the Piercewood building. The thing that, if he ever discovered it, would not merely void their agreement. It would end his. She sat with that thought the way you sit with something you have already decided not to put down, steadily, without flinching, the way her father had taught her to hold a compass in a strong wind, not by gripping harder, but by keeping your elbow still. Outside, a branch moved against the window glass. Once, then again. Agnes did not move. She had signed the document with a steady hand. She intended to keep that hand steady for as long as it took. Jonathan Piercewood returned to Northgate on a Thursday evening, exactly as Mrs. Calloway had said he would. Agnes knew he had arrived not because she heard the carriage or the front door or any announcement from the staff. She knew because the house changed. That was the only way she could describe it, even to herself. The quality of the air inside Northgate shifted when its master returned. The footsteps of the servants became more deliberate. The kitchen, audible from the east corridor when the house was otherwise still, went quieter. Even the light in the entrance hall seemed to organize itself differently, as though the candles had been reminded of their purpose. Agnes was in the library when it happened. She had spent the 3 days of his absence doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She read, she walked the perimeter of things, and she catalogued. She had catalogued the library with particular attention, not out of nosiness, but because a person's books tell you more about them than their correspondence ever will. Jonathan Piercewood owned 17 volumes on railroad law, 9 on civil engineering, 4 on metallurgy, 1 on bird migration along the Atlantic coast, and a complete set of Shakespeare that had never, as far as Agnes could determine, been opened. She was standing at the window with a book she was not reading when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. They were even, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had never needed to move quickly because the world had always been willing to wait. He knocked once on the open library door. "Miss Rutherford," he said. She turned. "Mr. Piercewood." He looked the same as he had in the office on Fifth Avenue. Same dark suit, same composed expression, same quality of attention that made you feel as though you were being read rather than looked at. He was carrying a leather folio under one arm, which told her he had come directly from a meeting. He had not yet changed. He had not yet done anything, apparently, except come to find her. "I trust the house has been comfortable," he said. "It has been very well managed," Agnes replied. "Mrs. Calloway is exceptional." A pause. Not an awkward one. There was nothing awkward about Jonathan Piercewood, she was already certain of that. His silences were simply silences, spaces he did not feel obligated to fill. "Good," he said. And then, "Dinner is at 7. I would prefer you join me." It was not quite an invitation, it was not quite an order. It existed in the precise grammatical space between the two, which Agnes suspected was exactly where Jonathan Piercewood preferred to operate. "Of course," she said. He nodded once and left. Agnes looked back at the window. Outside, the garden had begun to show the first faint suggestions of green along the fence line, new growth, hesitant and thin, not yet committed to the season. She understood the feeling entirely. Dinner at Northgate was served in a dining room built for 14 people and laid for 2. The table was long enough that, had they chosen to sit at opposite ends, they would have needed to raise their voices to be heard. They did not sit at opposite ends. They sat at one corner of the table, Agnes to Jonathan's right, in what Mrs. Calloway had arranged without being asked, as though she had navigated this particular geometry before, and knew that proximity, even forced proximity, was less damaging in the long run than the theatre of distance. The first course was served in silence. Agnes noted that Jonathan ate the way he did everything else, with total economy of movement, no wasted gestures, no unnecessary expressions. He ate as a man eats when he has trained himself not to think of meals as anything other than a logistical requirement of the day. It was Agnes who spoke first. "I noticed the library has an incomplete set of Tocqueville," she said. "The 3rd volume is missing." Jonathan looked up from his plate. A brief evaluation. "It was lent out," he said. "Several years ago? To whom?" "My father." A pause. "He died before he returned it." Agnes set down her fork, not in distress, in acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," she said. Jonathan looked at her for a moment, in a way that was different from his usual regard, slightly less composed, as though the sentence had arrived from an unexpected direction, and he was recalculating its distance. "It was some time ago," he said. "That doesn't particularly matter," Agnes replied. "Loss doesn't follow a schedule." Another silence, this one longer than the others. Jonathan picked up his wine glass, did not drink from it immediately, and set it down again. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." They finished the course without speaking again. But the quality of the silence had changed. Agnes was too careful to call it warmth. She called it privately a reduction in temperature of a particular kind of cold. In the weeks that followed, a routine established itself at Northgate with the quiet inevitability of all routines formed between people who are too disciplined to resist structure. Jonathan left for the city on Monday mornings and returned on Thursday evenings. While he was away, Agnes managed the household with a precision that surprised Mrs. Calloway, and Agnes suspected had been quietly reported back. She reorganized the account books for the domestic staff, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the previous system had a fundamental inefficiency in how quarterly expenses were cross-referenced against the estate's seasonal budget, and the inefficiency bothered her in the way that all correctable things bother people with good minds and too much time. When Jonathan returned each Thursday, they had dinner together. They talked, carefully at first, then less carefully, not about the contract, not about the debt or the arrangement or the things that existed in the legal language between them. They talked about the newspapers, about a proposed expansion of the Northern Rail line that Jonathan considered ill-timed, about the strange spring weather that had produced snow in April and warmth in February, about the Book of Tocqueville that Agnes had located, eventually in the study behind the east staircase, misfiled between 2 volumes on hydraulic engineering. "Your father must have been interrupted," she said the evening she returned it to the library shelf. Jonathan was standing in the doorway. He appeared in doorways often, Agnes had noticed, as though he was not entirely convinced he had been invited into the room he was about to enter. "He frequently was," he said. "By you?" A beat, then something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Occasionally," he said. Agnes slid the volume into its place. She did not look at him. "That means you visited him here." "This was his house," Jonathan said, "before it was mine." She turned then. He was still in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame in a way that was almost casual. Almost. And he was looking at the shelf of books with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that had not been fully prepared for the moment it found itself in. Agnes said nothing. She simply let the silence be what it was. He cleared his throat once quietly and left. On a Friday morning in the last week of May, Agnes received a visitor she had not announced and had not expected. His name was Franklin Cass. He was a lawyer, not Gerald Holt, not anyone connected to Piercewood's firm, but a man who had handled certain affairs for her father in the final months of his illness. He arrived at the servants' entrance, which told her he had come deliberately without wishing to be seen, and Mrs. Calloway brought her the card with the particular expression of a woman who has learned to deliver complicated information without attaching her face to it. Agnes received him in the small sitting room off the east corridor, the one that had no view of the drive and could not be seen from the main staircase. Franklin Cass was a thin man with careful eyes and the permanent slight tension of someone who spends his professional life managing the distance between what people know and what they are allowed to know. He sat down, declined tea, and placed a narrow envelope on the table between them. "Your father's final arrangement," he said. "The one he asked me not to file until you were settled." Agnes looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. "You should have come sooner," she said. "He specified after the wedding," Cass said. "His word." She picked up the envelope. It was light. 1 page, perhaps 2. The kind of lightness that certain documents have when they are carrying more weight than their physical dimensions suggest. "Does anyone else know about this?" she asked. Franklin Cass looked at her steadily. "No one connected to Piercewood," he said. "Your father was very specific about that. He understood the contract would require—" He paused, chose the next word with the care of a man choosing his footing on uncertain ground. "Discretion." Agnes set the envelope on her knee. Outside the window, the garden was fully green now, the beds planted, the roses just beginning to show color at their tips. "Mr. Cass," she said, "if this document is what I think it is, then the information it contains is not merely personal." "No," he agreed, "it affects the estate." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It affects considerably more than the estate, Miss Rutherford. That is why your father asked me to wait. He wanted you to be inside the walls before the walls knew what you were carrying." She looked at him. He met her gaze without flinching, which she respected. "Leave me your address," she said. "I will be in contact." After he left, Agnes sat alone in the small sitting room for a long time. The envelope remained on her knee. She did not open it. She already knew what was inside. Had known in the approximate way you know things you have constructed from fragments and silences, and the particular way a dying man looks at his daughter when he is asking for her forgiveness, without the dignity of being able to say the words. She had signed Clause 14. She had signed it with a steady hand on a bright morning in a high office on Fifth Avenue, and Jonathan Piercewood had watched her do it. And neither of them had said anything, and the room had been quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet just before something irreversible becomes permanent. She put the envelope inside the book of poetry, the same book it had always been in. She placed the book back on the shelf, between the Shakespeare that had never been opened and the 3rd volume of Tocqueville that had finally come home. Then she went to dress for dinner. That evening, at the corner of the long table laid for 2, Jonathan Piercewood looked across at her at one point during the 2nd course and said with no particular context, "You seem different today." Agnes held his gaze, steady, unhurried, the way her father had taught her to hold a compass in a strong wind. "I received a letter," she said, "from an old family acquaintance, nothing of consequence." Jonathan looked at her for a moment longer than he usually did. Then he nodded once and returned to his plate. The candles burned evenly between them. Agnes picked up her wineglass and did not let her hand tremble. June arrived at Northgate the way it always did in the Hudson Valley, without apology, and all at once. The roses along the east garden wall opened in the space of 4 days. The river turned from its spring grey to a deep particular blue that Agnes had no name for, the kind of blue that exists only in the hour before the light shifts in the afternoon and then disappears completely, as though it had never committed to being there. The days grew long, the evenings longer still. Agnes had lived inside the walls of Northgate for 6 weeks. She had learned the house the way she had learned most things in her life, systematically, without sentimentality, and with the acute awareness that the information might one day be necessary. She knew that the third stair from the top of the main staircase produced a sound under pressure that the second and fourth did not. She knew that Mrs. Calloway kept the household accounts in a locked drawer in the kitchen office, but left the key in the lock every morning between 6 and 7, out of habit rather than negligence. She knew that Jonathan Piercewood's study, the one room in the house she had never entered, faced west, which meant that on clear evenings the last of the daylight came through its windows at a low angle and made the room briefly, intensely warm in a way that the rest of Northgate never quite achieved. She knew, because she had stood at the study door on 2 occasions, that he worked in that warmth without lighting the lamps for as long as the natural light lasted. She had seen the thin line of orange beneath the door. She had not knocked. She had not needed to. There was something about the image, a man sitting alone in the last of the day's light, in the only warm room in a cold house, choosing not to extend it artificially. That told her more about Jonathan Piercewood than the 17 volumes of railroad lore and the unopened Shakespeare combined. She had filed this information in the same careful place she filed everything else. She had not yet decided what to do with it. The letter from Franklin Cass arrived on a Tuesday, the 8th of June, 7 days before the anniversary of the date on the original debt notice. Agnes intercepted it herself at the Morning Post, a habit she had established in the first week as a natural extension of her management of the household correspondence. Mrs. Calloway had offered no resistance. Jonathan, she suspected, had simply never considered that the Morning Post might become a matter of strategic relevance. The letter was brief, 2 paragraphs. The kind of brevity that arrives when a man is conveying something large and has chosen compression over clarity, because clarity in this case would require saying the unsayable directly. The substance of it was this: the document inside the book of poetry, the one her father had asked Franklin Cass to hold until Agnes was settled, was not simply a private arrangement between a dying man and his daughter. It was a deed of partial interest. Specifically, it was a deed granting Agnes Rutherford a 17% stake in a small land parcel in western Pennsylvania, purchased quietly by her father in the spring of 1887 and recorded under a secondary name that Cass had managed with considerable professional discretion. The land parcel was unremarkable on its surface: 43 acres of undeveloped terrain, moderately elevated, with a creek running along its southern edge. What the land contained beneath its surface was the reason Franklin Cass had used the word considerably in his second paragraph. Because beneath those 43 acres of Pennsylvania soil, a geological survey completed the previous autumn, commissioned not by her father, who was already dying by then, but by a mining consortium operating out of Pittsburgh, had identified one of the larger untapped anthracite deposits in the state. And Piercewood Rail, Agnes now understood with a cold, precise clarity, had been attempting to acquire that land parcel for 14 months, through Gerald Holt's office, quietly, without success, because the deed of partial interest, unrecorded and unknown to anyone outside of Franklin Cass's private files, meant that the transaction could not be completed, legally, cleanly, or at all, without the signature of Agnes Rutherford, who was now, by the terms of a contract signed in a high office on Fifth Avenue, the wife of the man who needed that signature most. She stood at the window of her room for a long time with Cass's letter in her hand, and the garden below her full of roses that had not been there 6 weeks ago. Her father had not made a catastrophic mistake. Her father had made a plan, and he had not lived long enough to tell her whether she was meant to execute it or survive it. She burned Cass's letter in the fireplace of her room that afternoon and spent the evening at the writing desk, composing a reply in the careful, angled handwriting that her governess had spent 3 years teaching her, and that she had spent the subsequent 20 years making genuinely her own. She told Cass to do nothing, to file nothing, to speak to no one, to wait. She sealed the envelope herself and gave it to a household boy the following morning, with instructions to post it from the town office rather than the estate. Then she went to breakfast. Jonathan came home that Thursday evening in a different mood than usual. Agnes recognized it not because he was louder or more demonstrative, he was neither, but because the economy of his movements, always precise, had become slightly more compressed. The way a spring becomes more dangerous the tighter it is wound. He was carrying more than the usual leather folio. He had 2 men with him, associates, she gathered, from the city office, who left after 40 minutes in the study, descending the main stairs with the particular haste of people who have been dismissed rather than released. At dinner, Jonathan was quieter than usual. Agnes did not press. She had learned over 6 weeks of Thursday evenings that his silences had textures, and it was worth identifying them before deciding whether to enter. This one was not the contemplative silence of a man thinking through a problem. It was the taut silence of a man who has encountered resistance he did not anticipate and has not yet determined its source. He spoke first, which was unusual. "Are you familiar," he said, refilling his wineglass without looking up, "with a land acquisition in Westmoreland County?" Agnes set down her fork with a motion so controlled that it made no sound against the plate. "Pennsylvania," she said. "Western Pennsylvania." He looked at her then. Those pale grey eyes, steady, reading, always reading. "My people have been attempting to close a transaction for over a year. There is a deed of partial interest that cannot be located. Without it, the whole arrangement is paralyzed." Agnes held his gaze. "That sounds like a significant complication," she said. "It is." He picked up his glass. "Gerald Holt believes the interest may have changed hands in the last year, perhaps through an estate." A pause. "The specific, deliberate kind. He is looking into it." The candles burned between them. Agnes counted her own heartbeats without letting the count reach her face. "I hope he finds what he is looking for," she said. Jonathan looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. Then he nodded as though she had answered a question she had not known he was asking, and returned to his meal. Gerald Holt arrived at Northgate on a Saturday morning, unannounced. Agnes saw the carriage from the library window and identified it. Holt's firm used a distinctive dark green lacquer on their vehicles, a branding decision she had noted and catalogued weeks ago without knowing why, and now understood completely. She had 12 minutes before Holt reached the front door. She used 2 of them. She went to the library shelf. She took the book of poetry. She removed the folded document from inside it. She did not take it to her room. There was not enough time, and her room would be the second place anyone looked. She took it to the only room in the house she had never entered. Jonathan's study door was unlocked. She had not known whether it would be. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly what she had constructed from the evidence available to her. Large, west-facing, lined on 2 walls with architectural drawings and survey maps rather than books, a desk of extraordinary size and organization at its center, and in the corner nearest the window, a low wooden cabinet with a brass lock of the kind used for document storage. She did not put the document in the cabinet. She was not that reckless, and she was not that desperate. Not yet. She stood in the center of the room, in the space where the afternoon light would eventually pool, and she thought Holt was coming for a document. He did not know she had it. He did not know she existed in relation to it. Not yet. If he found nothing today, it would buy her time. If Jonathan pressed her directly, she would need more than time. She would need a decision. She put the document back inside the poetry book, and the poetry book back under her arm, and she left the study and pulled the door closed behind her with 11 seconds to spare before she heard the front door open below. She met Gerald Holt in the entrance hall. He was shorter than she had imagined from his letters, compact, with a neat moustache, and the eyes of a man who had spent decades in rooms where everyone was lying to him, and had developed a finely calibrated sense for the particular texture of it. He looked at her with a professional pleasantness that did not reach above the level of his nose. "Mrs. Piercewood," he said, "I apologize for arriving without prior notice. I have urgent business with Mr. Piercewood." "He is in the East Garden," Agnes said. "I will have him called." She turned to the footman. She gave the instruction. She turned back to Holt and offered him the small sitting room with perfect composure, and the book of poetry, held loosely at her side, spine inward, the way you hold something you are not thinking about. Holt's eyes moved to the book for a fraction of a second, then back to her face. "Thank you," he said. She smiled, the smile of a woman who grew up in a house where her father made bridges strong enough to carry the weight of men who would never know her name. She did not hear what was said between Jonathan and Gerald Holt that afternoon. She was in the library at the window with the book in her lap, and the roses outside fully open now, red at their centers and pale at their edges, the way beautiful things often are, most intense where no one thinks to look first. But she heard Holt leave. She heard the carriage on the drive. She heard the front door close. And then she heard Jonathan's footsteps on the main staircase, not their usual even, unhurried cadence, faster, heavier, one hand on the banister. She could tell by the rhythm of it. He stopped outside the library door. A long pause, the longest she had yet measured in this house. Then he pushed the door open. She did not turn from the window immediately. She let exactly 2 seconds pass, 2 full, deliberate seconds, before she turned to face him. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not angry. Something further back than anger. Something that had not yet resolved itself into a single emotion, because it was made of too many things at once. Suspicion, and something that looked improbably and unmistakably like the early stages of hurt. "Agnes," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him across the room with the afternoon light behind her and the book in her hands, and 6 weeks of careful, steady performance coming to rest on this single moment, the way all structures, however carefully built, eventually come to rest on their narrowest point. "Jonathan," she said, and then she waited, because she had learned, in this house and in this life, that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who controls everything is make him speak first. He looked at her, the pale grey eyes, reading, always reading. "Holt believes," he said slowly, "that the missing deed of interest passed through your father's estate." The roses moved outside in a small wind that Agnes could not feel from where she stood. "Does he?" she said. It was not a question. Jonathan crossed his arms once briefly, then released them, a gesture she had never seen him make. The gesture of a man whose body is disagreeing with the position his mind has taken. "Is there something," he said, "that you have not told me?" Agnes held the book of poetry against her chest. She said nothing, and in that silence, in the 8 full seconds before she finally looked away, something passed between them that no contract had accounted for and no clause could contain. Not the truth, not yet, but the shape of it. She told him everything on a Sunday morning, not because she was cornered, not because Gerald Holt had found something, not because the walls had closed in far enough to leave her no other direction. She told him because she had spent the entire night sitting at the writing desk in her room, listening to the house breathe around her, and had arrived somewhere near 4 in the morning at the only conclusion that her father's compass had ever been built to point toward, that the truth, held too long, stops being a shield and becomes a weight, and she was tired of the weight. She found Jonathan in the study, the west-facing room, the warm one. He was already at his desk, already working, though it was not yet 7, and the light through the windows was still the pale, non-committal light of early morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. He looked up when she entered. He did not look surprised that she had come in without knocking. She placed the book of poetry on the center of his desk. She opened it to the page where the document had lived since the 1st of May. She set the folded deed of partial interest on top of the open book. Then she sat down in the chair across from him. The same posture, the same stillness, as the day she had sat across from him in the office on 5th Avenue, and she told him all of it. Her father's purchase of the Pennsylvania land in 1887, the secondary name on the deed, Franklin Cass and his careful discretion, the geological survey, the anthracite, the 17% interest that had made Jonathan's acquisition impossible for 14 months without anyone in his firm understanding why. She told him that her father had not made a catastrophic mistake, that the debt, real as it was, had been accelerated deliberately by her father's decision to stop servicing it in the final months of his illness, not out of negligence, but out of calculation. Her father had understood that Jonathan Piercewood would call the debt, had understood that Agnes, with no other viable option, would come to the meeting on the 14th floor, had structured the entire sequence of events so that his daughter would be inside Northgate, legally protected by the marriage contract. Before anyone thought to look at her in relation to the land, her father had been in the end an engineer. He had built the structure. He had trusted Agnes to walk across it. She told Jonathan this without softening it and without apology, because it did not deserve softening, and she was not sorry. Not for her father's love, however complicated its architecture. She was only sorry that she had not said it sooner, that she had let it live between them in the silence for 6 weeks, growing heavier with each Thursday evening, and each dinner at the corner of the long table, and each moment she had recognized something in him that the contract had not prepared either of them for. Jonathan listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The early light had made its decision while she was speaking. It was going to be a clear day. The warmth was already beginning in the corner of the room where it always gathered. Jonathan looked at the deed on his desk for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Clause 14, he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "You signed it knowing." "I signed it knowing," she confirmed. She watched him process this. She had come to understand over 6 weeks of careful observation that Jonathan Piercewood's mind was not slow. It was thorough. It did not skip steps. It followed the load-bearing structure of a thing all the way down to its foundation before it rendered a conclusion. He picked up the deed. He read it, though she was certain from the way his eyes moved that he had already understood its contents from her description and was reading now for the precision of the language rather than the information. He set it down. "The acquisition cannot close without your signature," he said. "No," Agnes said. "It cannot." "And the contract between us," he said, "is void." "By its own terms," she said. "Yes." He stood. He walked to the west window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the garden. The roses, fully open now, in the clear early light. The silence was not like the silences at dinner. It was not contained or managed. It was the silence of something that has run out of structure and does not know yet what shape it will take when it settles. Agnes waited. She had one more thing to say, and she was choosing the moment with the same care she had chosen everything else in this house. "I am not asking you to forgive my father," she said. "What he did was manipulative, and it placed you in a position you did not choose. You deserved to know from the beginning." She paused. "But I want you to understand that I came into this house prepared to honor the contract exactly as written, every clause of it, including the one that would have voided everything if you had found out before I told you myself." She stopped. Then, more quietly, "I chose to tell you. That was not in the contract." Jonathan turned from the window. He looked at her, the full, reading, undeflected attention that she had felt on the first day in the office and had learned over weeks to hold without looking away. "No," he said, "it was not." Agnes stood. She picked up the book of poetry from his desk. She did not take the deed. That was his. It had always been his in the only sense that mattered. She walked to the study door. "Agnes." She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She gave it 2 seconds. The same 2 seconds she had given herself every time the ground had shifted under her feet in this house. And then she turned. Jonathan was standing in the center of the room, in the place where the afternoon light would pool in a few hours, with the deed on the desk behind him and the warm morning coming through the west window. And he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was not entirely certain what the next move was. "The contract is void," he said. "But you are still here." Agnes looked at him across the study of his father's house, which had become his house, which had become, in the strange and irreversible way that 6 weeks and one long, honest conversation can accomplish, something she did not have a clean legal word for. "I know," she said. She left the study. She walked down the east corridor. She did not go to her room. She went to the garden. The roses were open, and the light was clean, and the river beyond the iron fence was the deep blue that had no name, the one that existed only for an hour before it changed into something else. She stood in it and held her father's book of poetry and did not read it. Behind her in the warm west-facing room the deed lay on the desk unsigned. The empire Jonathan Piercewood had spent his life constructing stood exactly as it had the day before, intact, immense, and built on ground that would never again be entirely certain beneath his feet. He had trusted the contract. He had trusted the clause. He had trusted, in the end, the wrong thing entirely. And by the time he understood what he should have trusted instead, Agnes Rutherford was already standing in the garden, free, clear-eyed, and holding the only thing her father had ever given her that no deed could transfer and no clause could void, her own judgment. And she had used it well.